For thousands of years, one particular image has stuck stubbornly in the popular imagination whenever people picture the construction of Egypt's Great Pyramids, an image so deeply ingrained that many people never once thought to question where it had actually come from or whether it held up against the physical evidence. Long lines of enslaved workers, whipped and driven mercilessly by their overseers, forced against their will to drag massive stone blocks under a punishing desert sun, a scene so vivid and dramatic that it has rarely been questioned, even by people who might otherwise consider themselves fairly well informed about ancient history. This image has appeared in countless movies, books, and even school textbooks over the years, repeated so consistently across so many different sources that few people ever stopped to ask exactly where the original evidence for it had actually come from. According to careful archaeological research conducted over the past several decades, this popular image is genuinely, substantially wrong, overturned by physical evidence considerably more detailed and considerably more compelling than most people realize. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves at all. They were paid laborers, and the physical evidence supporting this conclusion is remarkably detailed and surprisingly moving, painting a picture considerably richer and more human than the old simplified story most of us grew up with. Let's slow down and walk through this discovery carefully, piece by piece, because it's a genuinely fascinating example of how careful archaeological work can overturn an assumption that had gone essentially unchallenged for well over 2,000 years, quietly shaping how millions of people picture one of history's greatest architectural achievements. It's worth understanding where this popular image of enslaved pyramid builders actually came from in the first place, since it didn't originate with the ancient Egyptians themselves. Much of this idea traces back to a Greek historian named Herodotus, writing many centuries after the pyramids were actually built, during a visit to Egypt around 2,500 years ago, long after any of the workers who actually built these monuments had lived and died. Herodotus recorded a story he'd heard from local guides describing forced labor and considerable suffering among the pyramid builders. This account, though written a very long time after the actual construction took place, went on to shape Western understanding of the pyramids for the following 2,000 years, reinforced later by biblical stories describing enslaved labor in ancient Egypt, even though those biblical accounts describe a different time period and a different construction project entirely. For a very long time, there simply wasn't enough direct archaeological evidence available to properly test whether this popular assumption was actually accurate. This began to change significantly starting in the 1990s, when archaeologists working at Giza, the site of Egypt's most famous pyramids, made a genuinely remarkable discovery: an entire ancient settlement, essentially a small city, that had been built specifically to house and support the workers responsible for constructing these massive monuments, a discovery that would go on to quietly rewrite decades of popular assumption. It's worth understanding a bit more about the specific scientific techniques researchers used to study the diet and health of these ancient workers, since these methods go well beyond simply looking at bones with the naked eye. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletal remains can analyze the chemical composition of bones and teeth using a technique called isotope analysis, examining specific chemical signatures left behind by the food and water a person consumed throughout their life. Different types of food, and food grown in different regions or under different farming conditions, leave behind slightly different chemical signatures within bone tissue, allowing researchers to reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture of what an individual actually ate on a regular basis, even thousands of years after their death. When researchers applied this technique to skeletal remains from the Giza workers' cemetery, the results were consistent with a genuinely substantial, protein-rich diet, further reinforcing the physical evidence already found in the settlement's bakeries, breweries, and butchered animal remains. Mark Lenner, one of the lead archaeologists behind this excavation, had actually been searching for evidence of this workers' settlement for years before finally locating it, following subtle clues in the surrounding landscape and in earlier, smaller-scale excavations conducted nearby. Working alongside Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, who has spent much of his career studying and protecting Egypt's ancient monuments, the two researchers led a painstaking multi-year excavation effort that gradually revealed the true scale of this ancient settlement, eventually estimated to have housed several thousand workers at any given time, along with the bakers, brewers, and administrators needed to keep such a large workforce properly fed and organized. If you find it fascinating that an entire previously unknown ancient town could remain hidden in the sand for thousands of years, sitting quietly right beside one of the most famous and thoroughly studied archaeological sites on the planet, that's exactly the kind of remarkable discovery this story is built around. Before we continue, if you're enjoying learning about these hidden layers of ancient history, please consider hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you stories exactly like this one. This workers' settlement, sometimes referred to today simply as the lost city of the pyramid builders, was uncovered and carefully excavated by archaeologists Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, whose painstaking work over many years gradually revealed an entire self-contained community, complete with bakeries, breweries, sleeping quarters, and administrative buildings, all specifically built to support the large workforce responsible for constructing the pyramids nearby. The evidence uncovered at this site tells a genuinely different story than the old image of enslaved, mistreated workers. Archaeologists found large-scale bakeries capable of producing enormous quantities of bread, along with breweries producing beer on an equally impressive industrial scale, both considered staple parts of the ancient Egyptian diet and provided, it appears, in genuinely substantial quantities to the workers living at this settlement. Alongside evidence of bread and beer production, archaeologists also found the butchered remains of cattle, sheep, and goats, animal bones showing clear evidence of organized, large-scale meat preparation, suggesting these workers were fed a diet considerably richer in protein than what would typically have been available to enslaved laborers, or even to many ordinary Egyptian farmers of the same era, a genuinely significant detail once you consider how scarce meat generally was in the diet of most ordinary people at the time. If uncovering how much genuine care and organization went into supporting these workers fascinates you, make sure you're subscribed, because this exact kind of careful archaeological detective work keeps quietly overturning popular historical myths we've often simply taken for granted. Perhaps the most genuinely moving evidence uncovered at this site comes from the workers' cemetery, located a short distance from the settlement itself, a place that would go on to reveal some of the most compelling evidence of all regarding how these individuals were actually treated during their lives. Unlike how enslaved laborers were typically treated and buried in many other ancient societies, without ceremony, dignity, or care, the individuals buried in this workers' cemetery were interred with genuine respect, some in modest but carefully constructed tombs, positioned with clear intentionality and, in some cases, accompanied by small amounts of food and simple grave goods meant to accompany them into the afterlife. Exactly the kind of burial customs typically reserved for respected members of society, not for individuals treated as mere property. The discovery of this workers' cemetery came about somewhat by accident, in a story that itself illustrates how much of ancient history remains hidden until circumstance finally brings it to light. In 1990, a tourist's horse reportedly stumbled over a low mud brick wall not far from the pyramids, an incident that led authorities to investigate the area further, eventually revealing the extensive cemetery that had been sitting undisturbed for over 4,000 years. This chance discovery opened the door to years of careful, systematic excavation, gradually revealing dozens of individual tombs, ranging from simple, modest burials to somewhat more elaborate tombs apparently reserved for overseers and administrators who held higher positions within the labor system, such as one tomb belonging to a supervisor whose title translates roughly to overseer of the side of the pyramid, a title inscribed directly onto his tomb, giving researchers valuable insight into how this workforce was actually organized and managed. Some of the more elaborate tombs found in this cemetery even included small pyramid-shaped structures of their own, miniature versions of the massive monuments these individuals had spent their working lives helping to construct, a detail many archaeologists find genuinely touching, suggesting these workers and their overseers took real pride in their labor, close enough to the Pharaoh's own pyramid to feel a genuine connection to the monumental project they had dedicated so much of their working lives toward completing. Skeletal analysis of the remains found in this cemetery adds another genuinely important layer to this story. Researchers examining these skeletons found clear evidence of significant, often severe injuries, broken bones, and signs of considerable physical strain, entirely consistent with the demanding physical labor required to move and position massive stone blocks. Crucially, though, researchers also found clear evidence that many of these injuries had been properly treated and had subsequently healed, including instances of broken bones that had been carefully set and allowed to mend properly, evidence of amputated limbs that had healed cleanly, and even signs of relatively sophisticated medical intervention for the time period involved. This detail matters enormously for understanding how these workers were actually treated. Enslaved laborers who suffered serious injuries in most ancient societies were frequently left without any meaningful medical care at all, considered expendable and easily replaceable. The clear evidence of proper medical treatment and recovery found among the Giza pyramid workers suggests these individuals were valued enough, as actual paid members of an organized workforce, to receive genuine medical attention when they were injured, rather than simply being discarded and replaced the moment they were no longer able to work. There's additional evidence worth mentioning that further supports this picture of organized, paid labor rather than forced slavery. Archaeologists have found inscriptions and graffiti left by the workers themselves, scrawled onto stone blocks and hidden internal chambers within the pyramids, describing specific labor gangs by name, groups with titles like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkar, names referencing the specific pharaohs these particular work crews were laboring for. These labor gangs appear to have organized themselves with genuine pride and identity, competing with rival work crews and leaving behind cheerful, informal messages, entirely inconsistent with how enslaved, coerced laborers would typically be expected to behave or feel about the grueling work they were performing. It's worth explaining a little more about how Egyptologists believe this labor system likely actually worked, based on the accumulated archaeological evidence gathered from this site and others like it. Rather than relying on a permanent enslaved workforce, researchers now believe ancient Egypt organized pyramid construction through a system of rotating labor, where ordinary Egyptian farmers, during the months each year when the Nile River's seasonal flooding made farming impossible, were called upon to contribute a period of labor service to the state, working on major construction projects like the pyramids and jury duty, rather than the brutal, permanent chattel slavery long depicted in popular imagination. It's worth exploring this rotating labor system in a bit more detail, since understanding the practical rhythm of ancient Egyptian farming life helps explain why this arrangement made genuine logical sense for both the state and the workers themselves. Egypt's agricultural calendar was shaped almost entirely around the Nile River's predictable annual flooding, a period lasting several months each year when the river overflowed its banks, depositing rich, fertile silt across the surrounding farmland, while simultaneously making that same farmland impossible to actually work or plant crops on until the floodwaters receded. This left a substantial portion of Egypt's rural farming population with several months of otherwise unproductive time each year, precisely the period during which archaeological and textual evidence suggests much of the pyramid construction labor force was recruited and organized. Rather than sitting idle during this seasonal downtime, farmers could instead travel to major construction sites like Giza, contribute a period of organized labor service to the state, and receive food, housing, and other provisions in return, before eventually returning home once the floodwaters receded and it was time to resume planting for the coming growing season. This system offered genuine practical benefits for everyone involved. The Egyptian state gained access to a large, reliable, and seasonally available workforce without needing to maintain a permanent standing labor force year-round. Participating farmers gained access to substantial food provisions during a period when their own farms would have produced little to nothing, along with the accumulated social status and pride that appears to have come with having contributed meaningfully to the Pharaohs' great building project, evident in the informal competitive spirit reflected in the labor gang names discovered at the site. This mutually beneficial arrangement looks considerably more like organized, purposeful civic labor than anything resembling the brutal, coerced slavery long depicted in popular imagination. It's important to be careful and honest about exactly what this evidence does and doesn't fully settle, since ancient Egyptian society, like most ancient civilizations, absolutely did practice slavery in other specific contexts. And the full picture of pyramid labor likely involved a complex mixture of different types of workers, including some enslaved, individuals performing certain specific tasks alongside this larger core workforce of rotating, paid Egyptian citizens, fulfilling a form of obligatory labor service. What the archaeological evidence at Giza specifically and clearly rules out is the popular, simplified image of the pyramids being built entirely, or even primarily, through the forced, brutal, permanent enslavement of a mistreated workforce. It's worth taking a moment to consider why the old, inaccurate image of enslaved pyramid builders proved so remarkably persistent across so many centuries, long after any actual first-hand evidence supporting it. Part of the answer likely lies in simple narrative. Appeal. A story of oppressed workers rising to build one of history's greatest monuments against their will carries a certain dramatic, morally resonant power that a more mundane story of organized seasonal labor and rotating work crews simply doesn't offer in quite the same way. This dramatic framing found its way into countless works of popular culture over the centuries, reinforced particularly strongly by 20th century films and television productions depicting ancient Egypt, which frequently leaned into vivid, dramatic scenes of enslaved workers laboring under the whip. Images that, however compelling on screen, had little basis in the actual archaeological evidence available even at the time many of these films were originally made. Once an image becomes this deeply embedded in popular culture, repeated across generations of films, books, and school lessons, it tends to persist stubbornly, regardless of how much contrary evidence eventually accumulates, simply because unlearning a vivid, emotionally memorable image is often considerably harder than learning it was in the first place. There's something genuinely worth sitting with here. A reminder of how a single ancient account, written centuries after the events it describes, can end up shaping popular understanding for thousands of years afterward, long after the actual physical evidence needed to properly test that account finally becomes available. Herodotus wasn't necessarily being deliberately dishonest when he recorded what local Egyptian guides told him roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were actually built. He was simply passing along a story that had already drifted considerably from the actual historical reality by the time it reached him, a story that then continued. Drifting even further from the truth across the many centuries that followed, reinforced repeatedly by later cultural and religious assumptions that had little direct connection to what Egyptian archaeological evidence actually shows us today. There's a genuinely encouraging lesson tucked inside this whole story, one that goes beyond just correcting a historical misconception about ancient Egypt specifically. It shows how patient, careful archaeological work, digging quite literally through layers of sand and centuries of assumption alike, can eventually recover a truth that had been sitting quietly, waiting, the entire time, simply because nobody had yet looked in the right place with the right tools and the right questions in mind. The workers who built the pyramids left behind a remarkably rich, detailed record of their own lives, their bakeries and breweries, their healed injuries, their proudly named labor gangs, and their carefully constructed tombs, evidence that had survived intact for over 4,000 years, waiting patiently under the sand for archaeologists to finally arrive and listen to what these long, silent workers had actually left behind for us to find. So the next time you picture the construction of Egypt's Great Pyramids, it's worth replacing that old, deeply ingrained image of suffering, enslaved workers with a considerably more accurate and, in many ways, more genuinely impressive picture instead. Skilled, organized crews of Egyptian farmers and laborers, working in structured, rotating shifts, fed substantial rations of bread, beer, and meat, housed in a purpose-built sams. Built settlement, complete with bakeries and breweries, receiving real medical care when injured, and taking genuine pride in the specific labor gang they belonged to. The pyramids, it turns out, weren't built on the suffering of an enslaved people at all. They were built by an organized, valued workforce whose story remained buried and misunderstood for thousands of years, until careful archaeological excavation finally uncovered the truth sitting quietly in the sand beside one of humanity's most enduring architectural achievements.